Hello, today we're going to talk about positive psychology from a developmental perspective. If you have ever taken developmental psychology, you probably learned about longitudinal research done in the field of developmental psychology, where you take a group of people and then you study them over a period of many years. Well, this approach has been taken in the field of developmental psychology in studying many different areas, including those of interest to positive psychology. We've already talked about how in the 20th century, much of the focus in psychology, especially clinical psychology, on studying what is wrong with us. Well, one exception to that would be the field of developmental psychology, which has, of course, been around for a very long time, since the early part of the 20th century. And developmental psychology, from its inception, really, has had an interest in studying what is right with people from a developmental perspective, or what in the developmental field is sometimes called optimization, that is trying to figure out how psychological findings can be used to help people live the best life possible. Sounds a lot like positive psychology, doesn't it? Well, in our chapter on living well at every stage of life, we have the opportunity to look at the results of several different important longitudinal studies that have been done over the years and what they have taught us about living well, which of course is what positive psychology is all about. I want you to think for a moment about the level of commitment that would be involved on the part of a researcher or a team of researchers in doing a longitudinal study. You would be committing yourself to many years, typically decades of your life devoted to a particular study. Of course, during this time, you would have other interests professionally, as well as, of course, personally. So everything about your life wouldn't be about that longitudinal study, hopefully, but it would consume a big part of a researcher's life. It requires tremendous commitment of time and resources to complete a longitudinal study. And we get to be the beneficiaries of some of this work that dedicated people have done over many years of their lives. Just take the adult developmental study, for example, as described later in your chapter, where George Vaillant and other researchers have studied male graduates of Harvard University from way back in the 1930s. They started studying them, moving forward and studying them for their entire lives over a period of around 80 years. That study has been going on, or was going on. So, as a result of that particular study, much has been learned about predictors of healthy living, of well-being, by looking at how people are early in their lives and how their life turns out later on. And that's not the only study, as we'll see as we explore some others in our discussion today. For me, this is a very exciting area of research, and I hope that you can be excited about it too. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of resilience. I wanted to share with you two studies in particular that have looked at resilience in children. And these two studies have come up with similar findings. Interesting. One study was done by Emmy Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R, and her colleagues in Hawaii. And the other study was done by Ann Masten, Masten, and her colleagues in Minnesota. So both of these researchers have identified children who they believe were at risk because of the environments in which they were born and in which they were growing up. So they began to study these children using a longitudinal research design, and they studied them over a number of years. And they found that about a third of the children did remarkably well, even though they were growing up in at-risk environments. So they asked themselves the question, what is it about these children that may distinguish them from other children who had more unfavorable outcomes, who were born into similar environmental circumstances? Let's start by talking about a definition of resilience. So, resilience refers to a class of phenomena characterized by patterns of positive adaptation in the context of significant adversity or risk, and can be characterized as bouncing back. I'll read that definition one more time. Resilience refers to a class of phenomena characterized by patterns of positive adaptation in the context of significant adversity or risk, and can be characterized as, quote, bouncing back. So for the criteria for resilience to be met, the person needs to be doing at least okay now, and they need to have gone through some sort of adverse life circumstances that posed a threat to them and to having good outcomes in their lives. So in these resilience studies with children, researchers have identified certain personal qualities that children have and certain environmental characteristics in the lives of those children that seem to be protective, that seem to lead to resilience and help them to have better outcomes. So in the case of Emmy Werner's research, she found that two primary characteristics for resilience were if a child was born with an outgoing disposition, and if the child was able to engage in several sources of support. Now, in the case of Ann Masten, she identified three different kinds of what she called protective factors, factors inside the child, factors in the child's family, and factors in the child's community. So factors in the family and the community would be more like environmental factors, and factors inside the child, of course, would be more internal factors. And similar to Emmy Werner, Ann Masten found that children with a more outgoing disposition, as well as children who were bright and had good self-control skills, as well as some other characteristics, tended to be more resilient. And if they had family support or the support of other adult figures that they could count on, that tended to make a difference, as well as community resources that made a difference in their life, like supportive institutions such as schools or clubs in the community, say like Boys and Girls Club or that sort of thing. When you read about Ann Maston's research, you can look more in depth at some of the protective factors that she identified. Interestingly, Ann Maston, in her research, in describing these protective factors, refers to them as ordinary magic. And by ordinary magic, basically what she means is that these factors, these protective factors, are present in individuals' personalities and in our lives. So there's nothing really unusual about them. It's just that when they are present in the lives of children who are at risk, they seem to make a big difference in the kind of outcomes that may result, that may allow that child to be resilient, to bounce back, and overcome significant adversity. Another interesting longitudinal study involving children was conducted by Lewis Terman at Stanford University beginning in the 1920s. He identified 1,500 gifted children with IQs over 140 and then studied them well into their adulthood. Indeed, he did find that these very bright children tended to have a number of positive outcomes in their lives, although not to the extent that he was predicting, in that few of them went on to actually become prominent on a national level. But he did find that they tended to be more physically healthy, healthier than their peers. Most of them graduated from college, and most secured professional jobs. George Vaillant, his name is actually spelled V-A-I-L-L-A-N-T. You would think it would be pronounced Valent, but it's pronounced Valiant. He is a psychiatrist at Harvard University who's an older gentleman now who's been involved in longitudinal research since very young in his professional career. And while I've never met him, I would say he is one of my professional heroes because I have so much respect for him and the work that he's done over the course of his career. And one of the things he did was study some of the subgroup of women that were in the original Terman study. By the way, the kids in the Terman study were affectionately called termites. But Vaillant took a subgroup of some of the women who were in the original Terman study and examined the data on these women. And based on that work, he identified what he calls 6 tasks of adult development. Now, if you're at all familiar with Erikson's psychosocial theory of development, a theory that's covered in general psychology and developmental psychology, you know that his theory has 8 stages that covers the entire lifespan. And when you learn about Vaillant's work on this particular project, where he identifies these 6 tasks of adult development, you will be reminded of Erikson's theory. So his 6 tasks are identity, intimacy, career consolidation, generativity, keeper of meaning, and integrity. All of these are discussed in your text. I wanted to just comment on a couple of them. Generativity, which also comes right out of Erikson's theory, as you may recall, is the idea that when we are in middle age, we are able to be productive and feel like we're giving back, making a difference in the world, and especially giving back to the next generation. So, like Erikson, Valiant believed this to be an important task of adulthood. He also saw in later adulthood an important task is that of being a keeper of meaning. And of course, what he's getting at here is that older adults have the benefit of perspective from having lived a life that has allowed them to learn from considerable experience, hopefully helping them to have wisdom to pass on to the next generation, and to be able to protect rituals that can help the next generation to grow into adulthood in a way that will hopefully help them to experience meaning and fulfillment in their lives as they grow older. And Valiant's idea about integrity again comes right out of Erikson's notion that towards the end of life, we need to be able to look back on our lives and experience a sense of fulfillment and look back on our lives and see it as a life well lived. The MacArthur study of successful aging sums up successful aging in this way. Successful aging involves adding life to years more than years to life. And successful aging involves being able to avoid disease, to be actively engaged in life, and to maintain high cognitive and physical functioning. George Valiant summarized it this way. He said that successful aging involves joy, love, and learning. At the beginning of our video, I mentioned the Harvard Men's study that began in the 1930s and has followed male graduates from Harvard University around that time throughout their entire lives. George Valiant has been involved with this study, as have other researchers along the way. Thinking about how long this study has taken now, you can appreciate how it has involved several generations of researchers participating in the study. I have provided you with a wonderful video, a TED Talk by Robert Waldinger to look at as a part of your course module for this material, in which he describes the study in some detail. So I look forward to your thoughts on the video once you've had a chance to take a look at it. But I would like to talk with you a little bit about this study and also share with you some of my thoughts about the video as well. So in the study, researchers began to follow these men who graduated from Harvard University in the 30s. And they also had a comparison group of men who were blue-collar workers in the Boston area who were not highly educated. nor did they have the sort of privileges of the men who had graduated from Harvard University. They followed all of these men for many years. And interestingly, the blue-collar men that they studied sometimes would comment, I just don't understand why you'd be interested in my life. Whereas the Harvard men never once made that statement. So through this research, they were able to identify predictors of healthy aging that are described in. I'd like to go over these predictors of healthy aging with you. And if we were able to incorporate these healthy behaviors into our own lives, as hopefully many of us already are, hopefully it will be predictive of healthy aging for us as well. Not smoking or quitting young, coping adaptively, having mature defenses. An example of a mature defense would be a sense of humor. No alcohol abuse, maintaining a healthy weight, stable marriage, exercise, and being educated. Interestingly, in this research, it was also found that young men who had a more optimistic and hopeful outlook on life when they were young tended to live longer, to have more successful marriages, and to be healthier both psychologically and physically later in life. When you take a look at the video by Robert Waldinger that describes the adult development study, one of the compelling findings from the study that he talks about is how important relationships are to us for our well-being throughout life. As he says in the video, the good life is built with good relationships. Good, close relationships are good for our health and well-being. For Waldinger, there are 3 lessons that come from the adult development study. 1, social connections are really good for us, and loneliness kills. 2, it's not the number of friends we have or whether we are in a committed relationship, but it's the quality of our close relationships. And 3, good relationships don't just protect our bodies, but they also protect our brains. And he shares with us in the video a quote by Mark Twain that I would like to repeat here for your consideration. And this quote reminds us of how important it is that we can work to forgive one another and overcome resentments and not let them stand in the way of our ability to rebuild, if necessary, important relationships in our lives and stay connected with those that we love. Mark Twain said this: "There isn't time, so brief is life, for bickerings, apologies, heart-burnings, calling to account. There is only time for loving, and but an instant, so to speak, for that. And finally, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about my favorite studies, and that is the nun study that was conducted in Minnesota. So these researchers from the University of Minnesota went up to visit and study a convent of nuns called the Sisters of Notre Dame, who lived outside of St. Cloud, Minnesota. They were primarily a teaching order, and these researchers were interested in studying the Sisters of Notre Dame because many of them were living into very old age, often into their hundreds. So they were wondering, well, what's up with these nuns up in St. Cloud who are living to be so old? And not only are they living into very old age, but they're functioning remarkably well, up into their 80s, 90s, and some even past 100. When they got up there and began to study the nuns, they found that some of them, I think around 180 of them, had written autobiographies at the time they entered the order. So they read and studied these autobiographies and did a content analysis of the autobiographies, looking for expressions of positive versus more neutral to negative emotion. And fascinatingly, they found that the nuns who were more positive in their outlook on life when they were young women tended to live longer and have healthier lives than those who were more optimistic, pessimistic in their outlook on life. Now, we would have to say that this is a correlational study, not an experiment, so we can't draw any conclusions about cause and effect. But the results are compelling because they indicated that positive emotional content in the writings when these women were young was inversely correlated with risk of mortality 60 years later. Something else they found in their research that is really fascinating is that many of these nuns, upon death, had given their brains to science to study. As one of the nuns in her 90s said when interviewed, why would you give your brain to science after you die? And she said, well, I won't need it anymore, and maybe it'll help somebody else. So what they found upon histological examination of the brain tissue of many of these nuns, the presence of signs of Alzheimer's disease. But the nuns were not yet showing symptoms of Alzheimer's disease in their cognitive functioning and in their behavior when they were alive. So what the researchers believe is that they had built up resources over the course of their lives that helped them to stave off the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease because of the healthy lifestyles that they maintained. And of course, studying these nuns was especially fascinating to the researchers because while it was a correlational study, not an experiment, some of the factors that might affect longevity were fairly well controlled for just because of the environmental circumstances in which the nuns lived. They had similar levels of education. They were teachers. They had the same reproductive histories. They had the same access to health care. They had the same diets. They had the same routines. They had the same focus on spirituality in their lives. So there were a lot of similarities in the lives of the nuns that helped the researchers to have a greater level of confidence in the importance of their findings when they saw that those nuns who had a more positive, hopeful outlook on life tended to live longer and have a better quality of life. So when we think about the nun study, and we also think about the Harvard men's study, and other longitudinal studies that we've talked about today and that are described in our text, it really gives each of us a lot to think about in terms of, what kind of person do you want to be? And can we become more optimistic and hopeful in our outlook on life? Can we invest ourselves more in relationships and repair brokenness when possible in our relationships? Can we raise our children to be more optimistic and hopeful in their outlook and to experience deep, loving relationships as they're growing up? If we are able to accomplish these things, hopefully it can help us to have better quality of lives, and we can help our children also have a greater likelihood of having better life quality as they grow up into adulthood as well. So I believe that this research gives us lots of good food for thought, and I hope that you'll reflect on it. Thank you, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.